So this weekend I spent some time developing a P6 MCP. I went through and essentially curated all of the documentation resources. So I scraped their entire website for all of the help docs as well as the API and all the resources that they have available there. I also went and extracted the large language model text for training the model on how to develop MCPs, as well as took the Open API spec for P6 and wrote some scripts to essentially scrape the whole website and curate it all together. From there, I essentially developed an MCP. So this MCP has a bunch of functionality that we're going to be reviewing over today. So at its core, the MCP is used to integrate into Primavera P6. So the agents have the ability to understand and interact with the P6 API documentation. So that is the Enterprise EPPM, I believe it is, and basically to be able to have that integration with the agent. And so what it does is it curates all 585 REST operations and essentially develops tools from these and does an analysis of XER files, their specific types of workflow functionality, runtime controls, and capabilities to interact with organizations, teams, and configure it for authentication for many different users, as well as then like how we're going to deploy it. So essentially how this functions and works, you have your client here and essentially runs through the P6 gateway runtime. What this does is this is an orchestration layer that runs through a multitude of different functionalities to, in a sense, map out how to interact with the API and different policies, restrictions, features, capabilities, and then ultimately it then sends it to the API to make those requests on the Oracle side. And then up here, there is a Docker Compose sandbox, which then runs the backend system with a Postgres database and Redis for multi-tenant threading. When we go into the deeper, I mean, it basically says the same thing. There's the gateway runtime. You're leveraging a data source, which is the REST API or the XER files that are referenced. You have the capability layer, so this references all of the capabilities and functionality it has access to, as well as then the governance for like policies, prompting, auditing, metrics, analysis. And so the capabilities are really where the MCP layer is functioning in terms of like how it is performing those actions. And then the governance layer is like the functionality in terms of how the MCP is actually operating in terms of its requirements or things and rules that it needs to abide by. We can dive into this, but in a sense, this is how the entire orchestration of the requests are happening and where it's being referenced to and routed through for different of the capabilities within the MCP. And so going through the features, rate limits, response cache, the policies, and then ultimately interacting with the REST API, doing the authentication. And then there is some metrics and it will record all of the requests so then it continually can enhance and learn and develop itself for different functionality in terms of workflows and or requests that it uses consistently. It does function as an HTTP, streamable HTTP MCP. There are some backend systems to ensure that the system's operating functionally, that there's metrics that we can track to see what tools are being called. It's running on backend port 8000 and references the /MCP URL, so everything is contained underneath that one MCP. The tools catalog, so there's 24 different tools that are specifically developed for the P6 for the gateway to interact with. And so essentially within these, there are things like session content or context, discovery, so being able to determine what operations it has available, entities that it has, the schema for those entities. There are some specific workflows as well that maps to, and being able to then validate to ensure that, hey, here are the endpoints that we got, and validating the plan that it developed to then go through and implement those endpoints. There's, of course, dependencies required to make specific API requests, so it references those. And then there's specific execution operations and workflows to ensure that the API requests are happening. And then it can resolve specific IDs. It has mutations for being able to go through and preview the token and how it's being able to function in terms of what it has capability to do. The request for approval is when the policy is needing to be abided by, and there is a specific reference to the user that then can approve whether that request should be made or not. There's, of course, the auditing, the metrics, and various types of reports and features, as well as then like how that tool is being used and if it should be included in a workflow or some additional higher ranking tooling. And then there's feedback context that is provided, and then specific context for the projects, as well as then the schedule, so it can curate what schedules are available. There is then the P6 XER, so this is interacting with an XER file specifically, so not necessarily the API, but an XER file that could be referenced. And so what this does is there's 13 specific tools to interact with this XER file, like parsing the file, identifying the activities, the critical path, resource utilization, so it's being used, schedule quality, various resources, and the work breakdown structure for how all of those come together, and the relationships between the various events and activities, and then the calendars and the schedule summary to ensure that everything's functioning, and ultimately then the earned value and activity detail. The catalog, this is generated ahead of time and basically loaded as a bundle. And so essentially what occurs is there is specific operations that occur. And so it's fine tuning and prioritizing, when things are generated, identifying sources and operations that are occurring. So these are all the different like metrics and how we're referencing how the tools are being used within the MCP. And there's a bunch of metrics that are then recorded there in terms of what's happening, when it's happening, and all the requirements for being able to make those requests. You can see a graph here of how it kind of functions and brings together. And then, of course, there's a ranking functionality. So when it is curating all of the 585 endpoints, that is a lot of context to provide just to the agent. And so essentially what it does is it takes in the user's input, it runs it through all of the workflows, policies, operations, and then it does like a search to identify which operations it should be utilizing and the dependencies and requirements and fields that it needs to, in a sense, be able to perform that activity. So then once it does that, it will go through the policy to ensure that when the MCP is being utilized, ensuring that it has the capabilities to perform those operations and determine if and when it should be making those requests and if it has the capability to do so. Then the workflow engine, these are YAML files that are essentially loaded. So there are a few that are created. Essentially, it's a JSON schema or a YAML schema that essentially goes through and identifies the workflows, the tools, the capabilities, the requirements, and the parameters for all of the workflows to function. And so these could be quite expansive and be developed and further enhanced to add a multitude of different workflows based upon the user's intent. The concept of it is that you start the workflow, it loads in the playbook, the YAML file, and then it runs the specific operations to go through and curate the endpoints and the required data, and then it will run through and make sure that it's doing all the tools in the correct order and sequence, and then it will go through its entire approval process and then ensure that there's any checkpoints or failures or successes that are implemented. These are some of the playbooks in YAML files that are essentially created. These can be developed, enhanced, or there can be a multitude of other ones. Essentially what this does is it just makes the selection process for the endpoints more intelligent, so it knows what sequence of operations and what endpoints to leverage in the specific context that need to be provided to then perform that specific workflow and functionality. These are ultimately some key flows and how they're making their functionality. We kind of talked about this before, but in a sense, the user agent is then sending this data into the P6 gateway. There's some additional context and information that's provided back and forth. It searches then the catalog and then is then performing that request to the API. And there's the approval process that goes through the policy and requirements. And then this is for the XER analysis. So essentially what it does is there be a a Git project, you export that, you identify the service, and then you get the exported file, and then that runs the XER tooling to then do the analysis of that specific XER file. So this would be a hybrid API and the XER file analysis. Essentially, though, when the new onboarding is created, so a new organization can be onboarded, they add their grouping, they add their selection to the P6 connection for their service, and then if they save that connection, and ultimately they have a template that starts and connects it with their MCP client, like Cursor or Claude, and then they can run their prompts. And so a bunch of the configurations are in the backend environment variables, and so these are provisioned on an organization-wide level, and these are the capabilities that need to be implemented, or the data points that need to be implemented for the user to be able to interact with the MCP server, so the agent knows, hey, here is the specific credentials to provide when making those requests to the API. And then these are never exposed publicly. They're only for that organization and partitioned, so that organization only has access, and it's not cross-functionally able to be used by other organizations. And then that will go through and provide the authentication and identity management. And so there is the mapping orchestration that happens on the back-end service. So no two organizations are ever utilizing any of the same authorization tokens or anything like that. Then on the back end, there is some observability, so identifying what's being used, how it's being used, ensuring that the tools are functioning, that if any APIs are updated or any usage reports and everything like that is being referenced on the back end, and then those tools can be utilized or referenced for feature enhancements or further development or implementation into specific workflows. And so there's a ton of capabilities in terms of the observability and the telemetry that happens on the back end to ensure that the tooling is functioning properly and that the MCP is working as expected. And yeah, we'll go through, and then there are some workflow templates as we talked about, and these are in terms of like how the resources are being leveraged and utilized, and then how we get up to speed in terms of deploying this. And so we deploy it via Dockerized container, we start it, and then we have our streamable HTTP MCP available, and then it's off to the races. And so, yeah, there's a local sandbox if it's wanting to be tested on a local server, of course, having it on a remote server and referencing it via streamable HTTP URL is fantastic for security and deployment. And then, of course, there's some testing and ensuring that the entire thing's functioning properly. So this is just to make sure that as the tooling and the MCP is being enhanced and developed, that there are specific tests that the solution will run through to ensure that it's functioning as expected, abiding by all the security protocols, and that it will continue to orchestrate and function as expected. And then, of course, there's some of your current status and limitations of what it's capable of. But at the end of the day, it's a very robust and functional solution that has some additional commands here and is able to be leveraged and utilized for many different use cases. And so, yeah, super awesome tool. It's a great way to interact with P6 data and the API as well as XER files. And so, yeah, it's quite robust in terms of its capabilities and very, very functional. And so, yeah, thank you very much for the time. Really appreciate it. And talk soon.